Hello, and welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. In this video, we travel to Asgard, or Asgard as it is in English, the home of the Norse gods, there to meet one of the greatest members of that pantheon. To Asgard, not to Valhalla. You see, the gods didn't live in Valhalla. In fact, they couldn't have, even had they wanted to, since there is no such place as Valhalla. There is, however, Valhall, which translates as the Hall of the Heroes Slain in Battle, which was simply one of many halls owned by the gods in Asgard, though it was a very special one, Odin's Hall for Heroes, roofed with shields, where dead warriors were brought by the Valkyria, or the Valkyries in English, there to fight by day and feast with the gods by night. Somehow or other, what was simply a building among many buildings, albeit a special one, a great hall in Asgard is seen by most people as being the actual home of the gods itself, which it wasn't. Their home was Asgard, and the name is wrong as well. Like so much about the Norse people, and especially those of them known as the Vikings, it is a total misconception. But now, to the subject of this video, the goddess Freyja. This little amulet is a depiction of Freyja from around the 8th, 9th century. The original found in a grave in Scandinavia and now displayed in a museum. And this rather nice little statuette is based on the same traditional Norse design representing Freyja. Freyja is usually pronounced Freyja, though that is a modern pronunciation in several languages. Her name in Old Norse would be Freyja, so one can say that is the correct pronunciation, whichever language you happen to speak yourself. Now, there were two races or tribes, if you like, of gods, the Vanir and the Aesir, who had a war, the Aesir fighting principally with weapons, while the Vanir relied heavily on magic. Eventually, they got tired of fighting, since neither side was getting anywhere, and they agreed a truce in typical Norse fashion, an exchange of what might be considered hostages. Two gods from the Aesir, Heinir and Mimir, went to join the Vanir, while the Vanir sent three to Asgard, Njord and his two children, his son Freyr and his daughter Freyja. Though a Vanir, Freyja would become the greatest goddess of Asgard, and the best known to us today, dominating our view of Norse mythology along with Odin and Thor. There are two principal goddesses in the Norse pantheon, Freyja and Frigg. The latter often called Frigga, but that isn't correct. There's no A on the end, just as there's no A on Valhall, and there is no A on the end of the goddess Hel's name. She is Hel, not Hela. But Freyja and Frigg may have been one and the same, at least early on in Norse religious belief. There are similarities. For example, Freyja's husband was Odin, and he goes off and leaves her and never comes back. But she was very much in love with him and weeps for him, crying tears of red gold. Frigg was married to Odin. Note the similarity of the name, Odin. And he was frequently absent from her, and Frigg's name means love, which again shows a connection. Freyja was not slow to take lovers, and in Odin's absence neither was Frigg, who slept with the two gods who were minding Asgard while he was away, his brothers, in fact, Vili and They. Another interesting similarity. In one story, Freyja is actually mentioned as being with Odin, not Odin. Now later on, right enough, the two goddesses are mentioned as completely separate beings. Later on, they were seen as two separate goddesses. But in earlier times, they seem very likely to have been one and the same. Both names could have been used for the same goddess. Or, of course, it could simply be a confusion due to the fact that all the stories of the gods were verbal tales, not actually written down until after belief in the old gods had all but ceased to exist, pushed aside by Christianity, and frequently distorted by later Christian retelling of the old stories, which were slanted to suit Christian views rather than those of the Old Norse. As it is, Freyja has quite a few names, many listed by Snorri Sturluson in his Prose Edda, written in Iceland in the 13th century, and very much distorted by Christian viewpoints. And these names include Horn, meaning flaxen, Mardal, which may mean something like the brightener of the sea, Gefin, which means she who gives, and seer, which translates as sow, a female pig, since the pig, or rather in this case, the boar, is very much a symbol of the Vanir gods and sacrifices to them. And both Freyja and her brother Freyr are said to ride on boars, she on Hildisvili, meaning battle swine, and he on Gunnenbursti, golden bristles. She is also called Vanadis and Valfreyja, both of which I'll say more about in a moment. The name Freyja itself means a lady, especially a noble lady. So she is Lady, a title as well as being used as her name. And many girls were named after her in Norse times. One well-known example, of course, being Freydis Eriksdottir, the daughter of that famous Viking Eric the Red, and whose brother Leif was the man who actually discovered North America 500 years before Columbus never even saw it, since that gentleman, of course, saw no further than some islands in the Caribbean. The people who, I suppose, actually discovered North America are the Indians, or the Native Americans who got there first. Interestingly enough, the name Freyja, or rather its modern form Freyja, has considerably increased in popularity in both the United States and the United Kingdom over the last couple of decades. Graphs of the name given to babies rising sharply over that time. Why? I have no idea. It was in 19th place in the UK in 2011, and rising up to the top 10 a couple of years later. And of course, it's a common name in Scandinavia, ranked number 1 in Denmark in 2009. And surprisingly, there is even a popular Chinese singer in Taiwan named Freyja Lim. Freyja herself has a daughter named Hnoss, meaning jewel. Freyja is seen as the goddess of love, sex, gold and beautiful objects, fertility and seder or magic, and also by many as queen of the Valkyries, in that context also, of course, as a goddess of both war and death. And she is the patron of childbirth. She is said by Odin himself to be very fond of listening to love songs or poems. Indeed, she is patron of love songs, to lend an especially favourable ear to men who may call upon her, understandable of course, and it's good to invoke her in love affairs. Freyja is of course very much associated with the love aspect, though perhaps sexual pleasure, the joy of intimate physical contact for itself rather than being in love as such, might be a better way of putting it, since her own associations are intimate relationships that didn't really involve her actually falling in love. They were more interludes of physical pleasure, the enjoyment of intimacy with another person, one night stands, as we might say today. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a nice and natural thing. Though, of course, that would still give her a sympathy with and an understanding of those people who were in love, and no doubt a desire to assist them. Her concept of morality is different from what we might usually think today. She would be closer to the 1960s. The hippies, the summer of love, as it was called, going to San Francisco with flowers in your hair, where intimacy with another person could be simply an expression of the moment, not something to last a lifetime, but still a beautiful thing in itself and having no blame or shame attached to it. She is the embodiment of both emotional and physical love in all its forms, and things connected with it, fertility, pregnancy, childbirth. So a romantic liaison with someone would be to her as normal an activity as getting out of bed in the morning. There's nothing vulgar or dirty about her sexuality. It is simply a beautiful expression of the pleasure to be had in physical intimacy with another person. She is also, obviously I suppose, seen as a kindly and caring goddess, and the friendliest of all the gods towards the humans of Midgard. Now, that she is actually goddess of love is doubtful. Norse gods are seldom actually the god of this or that, but rather associated with something or other that they are then seen as being the god of. So Freyja isn't goddess of love in the sense that it was her job description, if you like, since she did not control it as such. She wasn't responsible for it, even the cause of it, in the Greek sense of being god of something. Persephone and her mother, Demeter, for example. When Persephone goes with Hades to the underworld for half the year, the earth becomes cold without her presence. Winter results, it snows. But when she returns and is reunited with Demeter, the sun shines once more. Flowers grow, everything is lovely, and warm summer weather returns. She and her mother together were the summer. They caused it. But Freyja could go to visit Hel in her realm of Niflheim for a few months without having the slightest effect on people falling in love, having sex, or doing anything else. Her own physical pleasure, her enjoyment of love poems, her liking for and assistance to those in love give her an association with love that can see her as goddess of love, but she has no actual responsibility for it nor control over it. As I said, unlike Persephone, she could sit with Hel in her high hall in Niflheim drinking mead and playing board games for 6 months without any lack of love or sex, any reduced fertility among women back in Midgard. There'd be just as many babies born while she was away as there would have been had she stayed in Asgard. Loki accuses her on one occasion of what today we would call sleeping around, saying that all the gods in the hall had been her lover, and some of the elves as well, and that she was even found astride her own brother one time, when the other gods walked in and surprised them, they thinking this was very funny. Now, she angrily denies this, and one could say that Loki was, well, hardly one to talk, given his own indiscretions with a female giant, Angerboda, as well as a male horse. But Loki, being Loki, was just trying to cause trouble and mischief as usual. Eventually, her father, Njordr, intervenes and tells Loki to shut up, saying that a woman having a lover other than her husband is harmless, and calling him a pervert. Yes, well, while Loki's activities were certainly paramount to adultery, as far as his fun time with Angerboda went, I'm not sure about the pervert accusation. I mean, is it a perversion to be, shall we say, on friendly terms with a horse if one is also a horse at the same time? Yeah, that requires further consideration. Loki also made similar accusations against other goddesses as well, by the way, but Loki was Loki after all. But, it's not surprising for Freyja to be free with her favourites, since in the Norse pantheon she is the personification of love, of romantic things, of sex and reproduction, not chastity, so she would hardly shut herself away from all contact with the opposite sex. One of Freyja's most famous romantic associations, though romantic is probably the wrong word in this case, is an intimacy, if you like, with not very attractive individuals, simply to obtain something other than physical pleasure, though the end was probably worth it. In that case, her golden necklace, Bræsingamen. One day she saw 4 dwarves working within a rock. Dwarves like to work in rocks for some reason, making this beautiful necklace, which she wanted, and she offered them money and treasure for it. She was more than happy to pay for it, and tried to do so, but the dwarves took a good look at her, liked what they saw, and said no, they would much rather have her instead. So she had to think about it and agreed, spending a night with each of the dwarves and then taking the necklace. That seems like a good trade. As to her role with the Valkyries, the romantic, flying armoured women who took dead warriors aloft to Valhall to feast with the gods, they are not described as actually having a leader, a commander, other, of course, than Odin himself, who gave them their orders as to who should live and who should die before he sent them out to the battlefield. They do not appear to have anyone who they seem to report to, other than Odin, obviously. But Freyja's association with them is principally due to rather indirect mentions of her in poems, as well as 2 of her names. Now, in the poem Grimnismal, Odin lists the various halls that the gods own in Asgard, and when he gets to number 9, he says how half the warriors who die in battle go to Valhall, while Freyja takes the other half to Folkvanger. He says, the 9th is Folkvanger, where Freyja decrees who shall have seats in the hall. The half of the dead each day does she choose, and half shall Odin have. Folkvanger translates roughly as the field of the folk, or it could be taken to mean the army field, folk in the sense of an army. And it's been considered to be perhaps a meadow or a large field of some kind, not seemingly the hall itself, despite Odin's calling it the 9th. But exactly what it is or where it is isn't stated, other than it seems to be somewhere in Asgard, and could actually be simply another name for Valhall, or even just a part of it, perhaps Freyja's part. She is also mentioned, of course, as riding into battle. Snorri states that in Folkvanger there is a hall belonging to Freyja, called Sethrumir, which means something like spaces for seats, and Odin does, of course, mention seats. And it is to this hall that she takes the dead warriors. And in a skaldic poem from much earlier, the 10th century, called Thorsdropa, the Lay of Thor, written by a skald named Elifr, it states that Freyja is the possessor of the fallen slain and of Sethramir and tomcats. Yes, tomcats. So, is she acting in the role of a Valkyrie, taking dead warriors, or is she even a Valkyrie herself? Certainly she is taking warriors, and she is mentioned as actually riding into battle, but it isn't clear if she fetches them from the battlefield herself, or simply takes them from the Valkyries as they arrive in Asgard. A sort of warriors for Valhall to the left, warriors for Folkvanger to the right, one for you, one for me, one for you, and so on. In one of the sagas, she goes to do something, to make a pair of kings go to war with each other, in fact. But the woman who then actually arrives and does it, the one who we would assume would be Freyja herself, since she has said she's going to do it, gives the name of one of the Valkyries. So again, we can't be sure. Is Freyja a Valkyrie herself using that name, or has she merely sent one of them to do the thing for her? That she has a connection with the Valkyries is clear enough. That she may actually be one is a possibility, though that is never clearly stated as such. But that she has some form of authority over them, or what they do, seems evident, given what Odin himself says about her. That does not make her their leader, of course, nor does riding into battle mean that she was officially a Valkyrie herself, nor actually leading them. And the only one we can say for certain did actually command them was Odin. Anything else is speculation. Another possible link with the Valkyries are two of the alternate names given for her, as I mentioned, and they are Vanadis and Valfreyja. Since Dis means a lower form of a god, a demigod, if you like, and Vana comes from Vanir, the family of gods from which Freyja comes. So the name means the Dis or demigoddess of the Vanir, a name that suggests a lower form of her status, not a full goddess. And the Valkyries are also not goddesses. Some of them are actually human or giants, but they are seen as demigoddesses due to their position and duties. So there again is a link between Freyja and the Valkyries. A full goddess in one way, but perhaps a demi-goddess in another as a Valkyrie. She might even be seen as the Valkyrie of the Vanir. And the other name, it has more direct connection, since it means the lady of the warriors slain in battle. Val being a word that means specifically a warrior who has died in combat, from which we get the words Valkyria, the choosers of the warriors slain in battle, and Valhall, the hall of the warriors slain in battle, as well as the Valgalinde, the wall that surrounds the realm of the dead, hell, the wall of the warriors slain in battle. So those two names could be taken as an indication of Freyja's connection in some way with the Valkyries. Another link to the Valkyries could well be her ability to fly and the method she used to do so. Now, the Valkyries are mentioned as putting on what are described as swan suits, some form of garment made of or at least covered with swan feathers, though we don't know anything much more about it. But it seems likely that it had something to do with their ability to fly, given that they seem to be putting them on in order to go and do something. More so when we consider Freyja. She is mentioned as having a cloak or garment of hawk or falcon feathers, featherskin it's called, which enables her to fly, and she has no problem lending this garment to other gods, even to Loki, who borrows it on one occasion himself to take her falcon shape, as he calls it, seeming to imply that it not only enables her to fly, but can also transform her into the actual form of a hawk or falcon. So, the Valkyries can fly and have something made of swan feathers. Freyja can fly and has something made of hawk feathers. There is an obvious possible connection between the two, something giving the ability to fly that is or has feathers on it. And perhaps Freyja's having hawk feathers was merely a symbol of her rank, the hawk or falcon seen perhaps as a superior bird to the swan. It might also be noted that Freyja rode a boar, whose name was Hildisvini, as I said, which means battle swine. Why a battle swine? Boars don't join in battles very often, if indeed at all. A further reference to combat regarding her. As well as flying around with her hawk feather garment and riding on her boar Hildisvini, Freyja also travelled in a chariot drawn by two tomcats. And in fact, she is mentioned as driving to the funeral of Balder in her cat-drawn conveyance. Why cats, not horses or even boars? Well, it's fitting, I suppose, since from ancient Egypt onwards, cats have been associated with femininity and fertility. And since these are tomcats that are pulling the goddess, representing all things female, perhaps combined with Freyja herself, it was a representation of the male-female requirement for reproduction. We know nothing about Freyja's cats, apart from the fact that she had them, but perhaps we should think of them as larger versions of the skog cat, or forest cat, which we know as a rule as the Norwegian forest cat, which along with the American Maine Coon are the largest domestic cats you can get. And these things are big. There's nothing really definite known about the origin of the Maine Coon, incidentally, but given its huge size and considerable hairiness, both very close to the skog cat in appearance, it has been suggested that cats sailed with Leif Erikson to the New World, since they were a common pet in Viking times, and when the ships later returned to Greenland, some of the cats stayed behind, and hence the Maine Coon was the result. A very important aspect of Freyja is her role as a vulva, as those women who practiced Seder, the Norse form of shamanic ritual, were known, the name meaning a wand carrier, one who carries a magic staff. And in fact, she may be regarded as the first vulva, having brought that magic art to Asgard when she joined the Asir gods there, the practice said to have been common among the Vanir gods, the Vanir, of course, having fought with magic during the war between the gods. Seder was a shamanic form of magic, often involving the study of fate and working within that to not only understand it, but also perhaps to alter it, symbolically weaving a new set of events. It could be applied to virtually any aspect of life, and some aspects of it still exist, of course, in modern shamanism in various countries. It was a form of magic that could give blessings or tell the future, cure the sick, assist the growing of crops, and even bring good weather. But it could also be used to do the exact opposite, bring curses, cause illness, kill livestock, cause injury or death, especially in battle, and give false prophecy so people would make the wrong decisions. That a vulva using her magic in an unacceptable way was truly believed in is shown by the fact that in Iceland, love poems, those things so dear to Freyja, were actually banned at one time, since a spell might be placed in them to force someone to love a person against their will. We couldn't be having things like that going on. A vulva was essentially a seeress, a sorceress, sometimes called a knowing woman for that reason, often travelling around from hall to hall or village to village with her wand, performing her Seder magic in return for, for food and lodging and other forms of compensation. And they bore no relation whatsoever to the seer portrayed in the television show Vikings, blinded and rather resembling an animated Egyptian mummy for some reason. And of course he is also a man, something I'll come to in a moment. A vulva was both respected and feared during the Viking Age, and for centuries before that, able to travel, even at night, alone and unarmed, anywhere in perfect safety. No one would dare to touch her. After all, nobody wanted their crops to fail or their cattle to die. And when she would visit a hall, the owner, be he a powerful jarl or even a king, would give up his seat to her, give her his seat of honor in the hall. A vulva could also go to war, accompanying an army to provide magic assistance. Now, it was seen as women's work, and though there were a few men who practiced the art, they ran the risk of being considered less than manly, and even being persecuted. For example, during the Christianization of Norway, sailor men particularly annoyed King Olaf Tryggvason, a man rather easily annoyed. Not that he liked any pagans very much for that matter, but doing women's work really pissed him off. And he had them bound and tossed onto a rocky outcrop in the sea at low tide, just to show everyone how pissed off he really was. The rather amusing thing about that is that the most famous man to practice Seder was none other than Odin himself, who was taught it by Freyja at his own request, and even he suffered the accusations of being unmanly as a result. Personally, if I lived in an age when heroic manly prowess was so greatly admired, and I knew a man who went around on a massive 8-legged horse and carried a spear that, when he threw it, couldn't miss and then returned to his hand, I'd be very slow to tell him he wasn't manly, even if he was wearing a blonde wig with pretty little curls in it and a pink dress covered in flowers. Who knew? Just like the Greeks and Romans, the Norse saw pictures in the sky made up of various stars, and to them, Freyja was represented in the night sky by the brilliant constellation we now know as Orion the Hunter, visible during the winter months, especially nice during January, or in the summer from the southern hemisphere. The entire star group was known as Freyja's gown, though also sometimes as Friggs. And the famous belt of Orion was called Freyja's girdle or Freyja's distaff, though again sometimes also as Friggs. The distaff used in spinning representing the Volva's staff or wand. And this consists of 3 bright stars, Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka, and they lie at an angle to the rest of the constellation, roughly in the middle, hence the belt or girdle reference. These stars are huge, as a matter of fact. Alnitak, for example, is 20 times the diameter of our sun and vastly luminous, but they look like tiny dots of light simply because they lie a great many hundreds of millions of miles away. If they were close to us, well, there wouldn't be any nighttime, each of them being many thousands of times more luminous than the sun. And if our sun, so bright as we see it, since it's very close to us, lay at the same distance, it would be so faint you couldn't even see it. But anyway, enough of the astronomy. And this isn't an astronomy video after all. Friday takes its name from Freyja or Frigg. There are conflicting versions, either Freyja's Day or Frigg's Day. But that, of course, could bring us back to the possibility that early in Norse religion the 2 goddesses were one and the same, or the result of confusion later on. Or just that later devotees of each of them picked their own favourite for the honour. Like many other things, there's really no way to say conclusively. One great problem we have with Norse religion and religious practices is that our records mostly date from long after the gods of Asgard had given way to the new faith of Christianity. Snorri Sturluson, for example, the writer of the prose Edda, lived 200 years after Iceland had been converted, and his writings, though he cared about the old stories and sagas and wanted to preserve them, are nevertheless very much altered and adapted to Christian thinking. Though in some places Norse conversion to the new faith had been mostly peaceful, based on intermarriage and mutual acceptance of peoples they lived among, as happened very noticeably here in Ireland, that wasn't always the case elsewhere. In Norway, for example, the previously mentioned charming man King Olaf Tryggvason made it his business to save the souls of his people from the dreadful and evil influence of pagan beliefs by torturing or killing anyone who didn't agree with him, destroying pagan temples and artifacts, and driving those who clung to the old gods underground. Writers like Snorri would have been very wise to play down or alter aspects of pagan belief, even to suggest, as Snorri seems to do, that some pagan ideas actually foreshadowed later Christian ones, making them more acceptable, making them less pagan. The concept of heaven as a paradise up there, and hell as a place of eternal fire and torment down there, for example, didn't exist in pagan religious belief. There was no heaven as such in pagan belief. The dead went to hell, the realm of the dead, cared for by the goddess of the dead who had the same name, Hel. And they lived pretty much as they had when they were alive, eating, drinking, having sex, fighting, and so forth. And it was even sometimes possible for someone in hell to send gifts back to their friends among the living, as was done by Balder and his wife. But of course, that didn't sit well with the Christian ideology of flames and brimstone and devils poking people with tridents. Another problem is that virtually everything we do have in written form comes from Iceland. Snorri's prose Edda and the collected poems of the Poetic Edda are Icelandic, and so we know little of any differences that might have been between the faith in Iceland and that in Norway, Sweden, or Denmark, or in Norse settlements across the world, like Ireland. There are differing versions, after all, of Christianity from different regions or periods of history: Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, innumerable Protestant sects, as well as 2 forms of Islam, something which may well have been the case with Norse paganism, spread as it was across a considerable area, from Newfoundland to Europe. Unfortunately, the Norse people in pre-Christian times never wrote books. Well, they could have, using their system of runes, but they didn't. All their history and religion, all their sagas were verbal, recounted by storytellers called skalds, or told by ordinary people to pass the time sitting around the fire. The Eddas were written in the 13th century, making them second-hand accounts, even when they seem largely unaltered, and often highly questionable, in the case of Snorri, for example. But there's nothing we can do about that other than keeping it in mind when reading the written accounts. Now, I have a very personal story concerning Freyja, which is this. My granddaughter took 2 kittens from a feral litter that had been rescued and named them Tommen and Hodor. Yes, she's a Game of Thrones fan. They have always been totally house cats. They have their living quarters, a cat tower, and beds in the bathroom, and they spend most of their time sleeping on the stair carpet or any other comfortable place they can find. Early one evening, there was no sign of Tom, though Hodor was wandering around the house, and I went in to see if he was asleep in the bathroom. The top light of the bathroom window had been pushed up, and no Tom. He'd gone out the window. Instant panic. He'd never been outside the house. He had no cat street skills, if you like. No knowledge whatsoever of anything outside the house. And we realized he'd been gone for some time. We went out in the garden, calling his name and shaking bags of cat treats, which always brought him running. Even if he'd been asleep, he would have come at the double for cat treats. Nothing. We toured the district, calling and shaking the treats, and we must have been out in the garden every 10 minutes or so, but no sign of him. My granddaughter was distraught. Hours and hours went by. Nobody went to bed. We couldn't have slept if we wanted to. It passed 3 o'clock in the morning, and we'd pretty much given him up as gone. I went to the altar here behind me, which is dedicated to Freyja, and I said something like, "Freyja, great goddess of the Vanir, you are associated with cats. Cats pull your chariot. Help us. Please bring Tommen home safe." And I went back downstairs. A few moments later, Tommen jumped in through the still open bathroom window. I leave it to you to decide on that. So that almost concludes this look at the bright goddess Freyja, the greatest and most respected, honoured and loved goddess of the Norse pantheon, the very symbol of everything good that is feminine, invoked in prayer with a blot or sacrifice by many generations of Norse women for her aid in romantic matters, to give fertility and protect the newborn, to make life better and more enjoyable for women in particular. Whether you see her in her sensual romantic role, armoured and riding into battle with the Valkyries, or just driving around in her cat chariot, she is a compelling and attractive figure, hardly inferior to Odin and Thor in her grandeur. On the final and very fitting note, Freyja is mentioned in the first stanza of Denmark's civil national anthem. Yes, Denmark has more than one. It has the royal anthem, played for the royal family or on military occasions, called King Christian Stood by the Battle Mast, and a civil anthem called There Is a Lovely Country. The royal anthem played on its own as a rule for state events, but often both of the anthems are played for other things. And the first stanza goes like this. There is a lovely country. It stands with broad beech trees. Near the salty eastern shore it bends itself in hill, valley. Its name is Old Denmark, and it is the Hall of Freyja. I think that's rather nice. So, until next time, I shall say farewell. Bye for now.